Rain slicked the street as eviction papers fluttered in a shaking hand. An elderly black couple stood on their porch, surrounded
Here
by
are the
cameras,
details.
whispers, and a
Please take
landlord
a
who
look.
believed time and power were on his side. The crowd leaned in, phones raised, certain this would end the way it always does. But then a horn cut through the drizzle. A car stopped. Another followed. And suddenly the balance shifted in a way no one expected. Who were the people stepping out, and why did the landlord's confidence drain in seconds? Before we go back, let us know where you're watching from, and if you're new to this video, subscribe to our channel Stories of Racism and connect with us for daily new stories. Because tomorrow, I've got something extra special for you. Before the notices, before the cameras, before the word eviction began to hover over the block like a storm cloud, life for Alina and Walter Brooks moved at a gentle, predictable pace. Their days were quiet, shaped by habits built over decades, the kind of routines that don't announce themselves as important until they are threatened. Every morning, sunlight crept through the front window of their small bungalow, catching dust in the air and warming the framed photographs that lined the walls. The house was modest, but it held weight. It had been paid for slowly, carefully, with years of labor that never made headlines. Walter rose early, joints stiff but spirit steady, and moved through the rooms with practiced care. Alina followed, her cardigan always neat, her movements deliberate, as if each step carried memory along with it. This was not just a house. It was proof. Proof that persistence could carve out safety, even in a world that often withheld it. Proof that love could be built room by room. The porch swing out front still creaked the same way it had when it first held the weight of 3 restless children, long before they grew tall and left the block behind. The maple tree in the yard had been planted the year the youngest arrived, its roots deep now, refusing to be moved. The neighborhood had changed around them. New cars replaced old ones. Faces turned over faster. Property values climbed, and with them came strangers who looked at the block not as a place to live, but as something to be flipped, measured, and sold. Alina noticed it in the way people slowed their cars, eyes scanning corners and fences. Walter felt it in the questions that began to circle, casual on the surface, sharp underneath. How long they had lived there. Whether the house was still worth it to maintain, whether they had family close by. They did, of course. But that detail rarely seemed to matter to the people asking. To the Brooks, life was still grounded in small certainties. Medication sorted carefully into labeled boxes, receipts tucked into folders and checked twice, Sundays that smelled faintly of lemon oil and old paper. Alina kept the house immaculate, not from pride alone, but from habit learned during years when being perceived as careless carried consequences far heavier than judgment. Walter kept records for everything, each payment documented, each obligation met. He believed, perhaps stubbornly, that doing things right still counted for something. Yet tension had begun to seep into the ordinary. It appeared first as a presence rather than an action, a man lingering too long near the sidewalk, a phone raised and lowered quickly, a car passing by slower than necessary. The neighbors noticed, though few said anything. Curtains shifted, conversations lowered, the air on the block thickened with observation. Alina felt it most in the quiet moments, when the house seemed to listen along with her. She found herself touching the brass key more often, the ribbon worn smooth from years of handling. It had opened the door thousands of times, through celebrations and losses alike. Holding it grounded her, reminded her that this place had been claimed honestly, patiently, against odds that were rarely acknowledged. Walter tried to dismiss the unease. He told himself that change was inevitable, that attention did not always mean danger, but even he noticed how often strangers spoke around them instead of to them, how easily assumptions formed, how quickly their age, their race, and their quietness became reasons to overlook them. What neither of them could see yet was how closely they were being watched, or how calculations were already being made about their future without their consent. To some, they were not a couple with a history. They were an obstacle, a delay, a house that stood in the way of profit. The block still looked the same from the outside. Children rode bikes past the porch, Rainwater pooled in familiar cracks in the pavement, but beneath the surface something had shifted. Lines were being drawn, papers prepared, timelines set. And while Alina and Walter continued their routines, believing that fairness and patience would hold, a conflict was already forming, one that would test not only their claim to a home, but the unspoken rules about who is protected, who is pressured, and who is expected to quietly disappear when power comes knocking. They did not know it yet, but the calm they were living in was borrowed time, and when it ended, it would not end quietly. As the days passed, the sense of being observed sharpened into something harder to ignore. It was no longer just a feeling that came and went. It lingered. It followed them from room to room, from porch to kitchen, settling into the pauses between their conversations. Alina began closing the curtains earlier in the evening, even before the sun had fully dipped. Walter double-checked the locks at night, not because he feared break-ins, but because the act itself reassured him that some boundaries were still his to control. The first letter arrived quietly, slipped through the mail slot without ceremony. No knock, no warning. Alina found it resting on the rug as she swept the entryway, its edges stiff and official. She stood there longer than necessary before picking it up, as if the paper itself carried weight. Walter read it twice, then a third time, lips tightening with each line. The language was formal, detached, and confident in a way that assumed resistance would be brief and futile. They told themselves it was a mistake. Clerical errors happened. Notices were sent to the wrong addresses. Systems corrected themselves when people spoke up. Alina gathered documents that afternoon, laying them neatly across the dining table. Deeds, receipts, old correspondence. Walter organized them into folders, each labeled carefully, his handwriting steady despite the stiffness in his hands. This was familiar territory for them, responding calmly, proving themselves, staying composed. But the response they received was colder than expected. Phone calls went unanswered. Messages were acknowledged without resolution. Each interaction carried an unspoken impatience, as though their insistence on being heard was an inconvenience rather than a right. The tone was subtle, never overtly hostile, yet unmistakably dismissive. It suggested that time was not on their side, and that resistance would only make things harder. Around them, the neighborhood reacted in fragments. Some neighbors offered sympathetic looks but avoided conversation. Others whispered speculation that drifted across hedges and sidewalks. A few leaned into the spectacle, recording short clips and sharing them without context. Alina noticed how quickly concern turned into curiosity, how easily someone else's hardship became content. Walter tried to shield her from it, positioning himself between the house and the street whenever strangers lingered too long. He told her not to worry, that they had lived through worse, that this too would pass. But even he felt the strain. It showed in the way his shoulders slumped at the end of the day, in the extra time he spent staring at paperwork that he already knew by heart. What unsettled Alina most was the speed. The pressure escalated quickly, faster than felt reasonable, faster than felt lawful. Notices arrived closer together. Visits became more frequent. Each step forward by the people watching them felt deliberate, as though the outcome had already been decided and the process was merely a formality. She began to think about the past more often, about the years when proving worth had been a daily necessity, not a choice, about how easily stability could be questioned when it was held by the wrong hands. The house, once a place of rest, now seemed to hold its breath along with her. Walter noticed her touching the brass key more frequently, turning it over in her palm as if memorizing its weight. He said nothing, but he understood. That key was not just metal. It was a promise fulfilled, a reminder that they had earned this place inch by inch, despite systems that were never designed with them in mind. What neither of them said aloud was the fear that fairness alone might not protect them this time, that doing everything right might still not be enough. Still, they refused to pack. Boxes remained empty. Furniture stayed where it was. Alina dusted the shelves and rearranged photographs as she always had. Walter tended to the porch, fixing loose boards and oiling the swing chain. These small acts of care were quiet declarations. They were still here. They were not yielding. Outside, interest in the house grew. Cars slowed more noticeably now. Strangers stopped to take photos without explanation. A sense of inevitability began to hang over the block, as though everyone but the Brooks had accepted what was coming. The tension was no longer hidden. It sat openly in the air, thick and unresolved. What Alina and Walter did not know was how closely their situation was being tracked beyond the block, how conversations were unfolding in offices far away, how assumptions about their isolation were being made with confidence. To those pushing the process forward, this was expected to be simple. Two elderly people, minimal resistance, a quiet transition. But assumptions have a way of collapsing under scrutiny. As the pressure mounted, a line was quietly crossed, one that transformed inconvenience into threat. And once that line was crossed, the situation could no longer remain small or private. What had begun as paperwork was moving toward something far more public, far more visible. The calm routines Alina and Walter clung to were about to collide with a force that did not intend to slow down. And while they still believed they were standing alone, the story forming around them was already bigger than the house, bigger than the block, and far bigger than the people who thought they could erase them without consequence. The pressure did not arrive all at once. It crept in layers, each one heavier than the last, until Alina and Walter could feel it even in moments meant for rest. What had started as letters and unanswered calls hardened into something unmistakably hostile. The tone shifted from distant bureaucracy to quiet aggression, the kind that hides behind legal language while relying on fear to do the real work. Certified envelopes began appearing with increasing frequency, their arrival predictable yet always unsettling. Each one carried stricter language, shorter deadlines, and a growing assumption that compliance was inevitable. Walter read every line carefully, tracing dates and figures with his finger, comparing them to his own records. The math never changed. The payments were current. The obligations met. Still, the notices insisted otherwise, as if repetition alone could rewrite reality. Alina noticed how quickly the story around them was being shaped without their consent. A contractor appeared one afternoon, measuring windows and jotting notes without asking permission. Another day, a laminated notice was stapled to the maple tree out front, its red lettering stark against the bark. Neighbors gathered in clusters, whispering interpretations that traveled faster than facts. Some speculated about unpaid debts. Others assumed the house had already changed hands. Very few asked the Brooks directly. The sense of being judged without being heard settled deep. Phones began to surface whenever Victor appeared, raised openly now, no longer pretending discretion. He spoke loudly on the sidewalk, his gestures exaggerated, as if performing for an invisible audience. His presence carried confidence, the kind that came from knowing the system favored speed and spectacle over nuance. Alina felt it every time he stood too close to the porch, every time his eyes moved over the house not as a home, but as an asset. Walter tried to engage the process, to slow it down with evidence and appeals. He mailed copies, requested confirmations, documented every interaction. But the responses grew colder, more procedural. The system moved like a machine, indifferent to context. It did not pause for age, history, or fairness. It simply advanced. What made the injustice sharper was how familiar it felt. Alina recognized the pattern instantly. The assumption that resistance was temporary, that exhaustion would eventually replace resolve, that silence could be forced through pressure rather than persuasion. It was not loud discrimination. It was quiet, calculated, and devastatingly effective. Inside the house, the atmosphere changed. The walls that once held warmth now echoed with tension. Alina found herself cleaning surfaces that were already spotless, searching for control in repetition. Walter organized documents late into the night, his eyes burning, his hands aching, refusing to let disorder win. Sleep became shallow, fractured by the knowledge that something irreversible was approaching. The neighborhood, once merely observant, became complicit through inaction. Some neighbors avoided eye contact entirely. Others filmed from across the street, narrating the situation as if it were unfolding theater. The Brooks' reality was being consumed in fragments, stripped of context, repackaged for curiosity. Then came the sheriff's postcard. It arrived without warning, its message blunt and final. Possession date set. Alina read it standing in the doorway, the late afternoon light catching the edges of the card. For a moment, her breath stalled. The words carried weight beyond their ink. They marked a shift from threat to execution. Walter read it next. He said nothing at first. He simply folded the card and placed it face down on the table as if turning it away might soften its meaning. That night neither of them slept. The house seemed louder in the dark. Pipes clicked. Floorboards settled. Sirens passed somewhere distant. Walter counted Alina's breaths, measuring the spaces between them, knowing that fear often hides in silence. The days that followed moved too quickly. A moving truck was spotted idling at the corner one morning, its presence unmistakable. The driver tapped the steering wheel, waiting. Victor appeared more frequently now, his confidence sharpened by proximity to the end. Each visit carried the same message without needing words. Time was nearly up. On the block, anticipation grew thick. People gathered earlier, lingered longer. Someone mentioned how viral moments often begin quietly. Another speculated about how the footage might play online. Alina noticed how easily empathy dissolved into entertainment. She stood straighter because of it, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her bend. Walter adjusted his collar on the morning everything escalated, his movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. He placed his cane carefully, not as support alone, but as statement. Alina pressed the brass key flat against her chest, its ribbon damp from her palm. The house felt different then, as if it knew this was a threshold moment. When Victor arrived with the sheriff and movers, the tension snapped taut. The sidewalk filled quickly. Phones rose. The air tasted metallic, charged with anticipation. The movers stepped forward, boots heavy on the steps, their eyes avoiding the couple entirely. Procedure moved forward, indifferent to protest. Walter held out receipts. Alina stood beside him, steady but pale. The sheriff glanced at the papers briefly, then looked away. The process continued. That was when the horn sounded. It cut through the noise with precision, long and deliberate. Heads turned in unison. The moving truck driver straightened. Conversation stalled mid-sentence. A sleek black sedan eased into view, tires hissing against wet pavement, stopping directly in front of the house. For a fraction of a second, no one moved. Then the door opened. The presence that emerged carried authority without spectacle, purpose without hesitation. Alina felt it before she fully understood it. The air shifted. The balance tilted. Something unaccounted for had entered the equation. The crowd leaned forward, phones adjusted, whispers surged. The sheriff hesitated. Victor's confidence flickered just briefly like a light losing power. What had been framed as a simple eviction was no longer contained. As another vehicle appeared at the corner, then another, the narrative began to unravel. The assumptions made about isolation, about weakness, about silence, cracked under the weight of reality. The block that had watched passively now reacted audibly, sensing the turn even before understanding it. Alina's grip tightened around the brass key. Walter steadied himself, his heart pounding not with fear but with recognition. This moment, whatever followed, would not be quiet. It would not be small. The people who had counted on invisibility were about to be seen, and the injustice that had thrived in paperwork and whispers was about to collide with something it had not prepared for. The question was no longer whether the eviction would happen. It was what the world was about to witness when it didn't. The arrival of the first car did not stop the process immediately, but it slowed it just enough to expose the cracks. Procedures that had moved with cold efficiency moments earlier suddenly hesitated. The sheriff glanced from the papers in his hand to the woman stepping forward with unmistakable purpose. The movers paused mid-step, uncertainty rippling through their posture. Victor recovered first, forcing a tight smile as though nothing had changed, but the confidence behind it had thinned. Alina felt the shift in her chest before she fully understood it. For days, fear had pressed down on her ribs, heavy and constant. Now it loosened just enough to let something else through. Not relief. Not yet. But awareness. Whatever was unfolding was no longer controlled solely by the people who had pushed this moment into existence. More vehicles followed, each arrival pulling the scene further out of Victor's grasp. The street, once dominated by his voice and his paperwork, became crowded with attention he could not direct. Conversations overlapped. Neighbors leaned forward instead of back. Phones, once pointed discreetly, were now held high, capturing every angle, every reaction. The system that had relied on speed and silence suddenly found itself under a microscope. Victor spoke quickly, gesturing toward documents, repeating phrases about legality and deadlines. But his words collided with new information, with questions he had not anticipated. Each interruption disrupted the narrative he had been building. He attempted to regain control by raising his voice, but volume could not replace authority once doubt had entered the space. Walter stood quietly through it all, his cane grounded against the step. His body ached, his heart raced, but his focus sharpened. He watched the exchange unfold with the patience of someone who had learned, long ago, that timing mattered. He had waited decades to build stability. He could wait moments longer for truth to surface. Alina remained still, the brass key hidden in her closed fist. The ribbon brushed her wrist with each small movement, a reminder of everything this house represented. She listened carefully, catching fragments of language that hinted at errors, misrepresentations, shortcuts taken with intent. The injustice was no longer abstract. It was being named piece by piece. The crowd sensed it too. Whispers shifted in tone. Where there had been speculation, there was now curiosity edged with disbelief. Some neighbors exchanged looks that said more than words could. Others leaned into their screens, recognizing that the story they thought they knew was unraveling. Victor's frustration began to show. His movements grew sharper, less controlled. He argued not just with the newcomers but with the moment itself, resisting a reality that no longer bent to his assumptions. He had expected compliance, not challenge. Silence, not scrutiny. As paperwork changed hands, the sheriff's posture shifted subtly. His stance, once rigid with procedure, loosened just enough to suggest reconsideration. He scanned documents more carefully this time, paused longer, asked questions that had not been asked before. The machine slowed. The movers stepped back, boxes lowered to the ground. Their eyes avoided Victor, now, instinctively distancing themselves from a situation that no longer felt routine. What had been framed as a simple enforcement of rules now carried risk, attention, and consequence. Alina noticed how the house itself seemed to breathe again. The porch light flickered once in the gray afternoon, catching droplets of rain and turning them briefly into sparks. She lifted her chin slightly, refusing to shrink, even as emotion swelled behind her composure. The injustice that had thrived in isolation was losing its cover. Yet tension remained. Nothing had been resolved. The threat had not vanished. It had only been interrupted. Victor regrouped, adjusting his stance, recalculating. He still believed authority would favor him if he pushed hard enough. He still believed exhaustion would finish what pressure had started. But the moment had changed shape. The block that had once watched passively now felt charged, alive with the sense that something consequential was unfolding. This was no longer just about a house. It was about who gets believed, who gets protected, and who is allowed to claim space without apology. Walter shifted his weight, steadying himself as Alina stepped slightly closer. They did not speak. They did not need to. Years of shared resilience filled the silence between them. The rising action did not peak with shouting or confrontation. It climbed through pauses, through glances exchanged, through the slow realization that power was not as one-sided as it had seemed. Each second stretched, heavy with possibility. And as the rain softened to a fine mist, one truth became undeniable. The attempt to quietly erase the Brooks had failed. What came next would not happen behind closed doors or in unread letters. It would happen in full view, recorded, witnessed, and impossible to dismiss. The story was no longer slipping away from them. It was turning. The hesitation that settled over the street did not bring relief. It sharpened everything. Time stretched, thin and fragile as if the wrong word could snap it. Victor sensed it too. His movement slowed, his eyes darting from face to face, calculating. He had built his approach on momentum, on pushing forward so quickly that resistance never had time to gather shape. Now momentum had stalled, and the silence made room for questions he could not easily answer. He tried again, speaking louder, more forcefully, repeating claims about missed payments and expired appeals. But repetition no longer carried authority. Each sentence landed with less certainty than the one before it. The words sounded rehearsed, hollow against the evidence now circulating hand to hand. What had once been framed as law now looked like pressure. What had been called procedure now resembled coercion. Alina watched the exchange with a strange clarity. Fear still lived in her chest, but it no longer ruled her. In its place was something steadier, a calm sharpened by years of navigating spaces where dignity had to be defended quietly. She noticed how Victor avoided meeting her eyes, how he spoke about the house without ever acknowledging the people who lived inside it. The pattern was familiar. It had always been easier for some to erase humanity than to confront it. The crowd grew denser. More neighbors drifted closer, drawn by the tension they could feel even from down the block. The murmurs changed texture, moving from speculation to disbelief. Some faces registered shame, others surprise. A few carried recognition, as if this scene confirmed truths they had long sensed but never named. Walter's breathing slowed as he grounded himself. He could feel the ache in his back, the fatigue in his legs, but he refused to let his body betray the moment. He thought of the years he had spent proving his reliability to systems that never fully trusted him, of the countless times he had been expected to be grateful simply for being allowed to remain. Standing there now, he understood something with painful clarity. Compliance had never been enough. Visibility mattered. The sheriff cleared his throat, a small sound that cut through the tension more effectively than shouting could have. He adjusted his grip on the clipboard, his eyes returning to the paperwork with renewed focus. This time he did not skim. He read. He compared. He paused. Each pause stretched Victor thinner. The movers shifted their weight again, glancing toward their truck, then back at the porch. They were workers, not villains, but they understood risk when they saw it. This job no longer felt clean. It no longer felt protected by routine. The presence of attention, of accountability, changed everything. Rain continued to fall, light but persistent, dotting shoulders and pavement alike. It softened edges while amplifying sound. Every shuffle of feet, every intake of breath felt amplified. Alina noticed how the brass key had warmed completely in her palm, as if absorbing her resolve. She loosened her grip just enough to let its weight settle, grounding her. Victor attempted one final push, stepping closer than before, invading space under the guise of authority. Alina did not retreat. Neither did Walter. Their stillness became its own statement. The distance Victor expected to command no longer existed. A subtle shift rippled through the bystanders. Phones tilted higher. Angles adjusted. People sensed instinctively that the next moments would matter, that whatever happened next would be replayed, analyzed, remembered. The injustice that had thrived in paperwork and pressure was being dragged into daylight. Victor faltered mid-sentence, his words tangling as he realized the narrative had slipped beyond his control. He was no longer speaking to intimidate the couple. He was speaking to defend himself. The difference showed. Alina felt the weight of decades lift slightly from her shoulders, not because the fight was over, but because it was finally being seen for what it was. She glanced at Walter, and for a brief moment they shared something unspoken but profound. They were no longer alone in this. The silence that had once isolated them was now filled with witnesses. The rising action pressed upward, not through chaos, but through exposure. Each layer of truth peeled back weakened the structure that had threatened to crush them. The street had become a stage, whether anyone wanted it to or not. And as the tension climbed toward a breaking point, one reality settled over the block with undeniable force. This was no longer a quiet eviction. It was a reckoning in progress. The reckoning did not arrive with shouting or sudden victory. It built through pressure, through the slow collapse of certainty on one side and the steady accumulation of truth on the other. Victor felt it slipping, and desperation sharpened him. He pointed, gestured, repeated claims with increasing urgency, as if volume alone could restore the order he expected. But every attempt only drew more attention to the gaps in his story. The sheriff shifted again, this time stepping slightly away from Victor. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, yet its meaning was unmistakable. Authority was no longer aligned where Victor assumed it would be. The clipboard lowered a fraction. The tone changed. Questions surfaced, quiet, procedural, but dangerous. Dates were checked, names verified, timelines reconsidered. The machine that had moved without pause was now grinding, uncertain, exposed. Alina felt the air around her thicken with anticipation. She became acutely aware of her body, the rain on her sleeves, the firmness of the porch beneath her shoes, the steady presence of Walter beside her. She had spent years learning how to remain composed under scrutiny, how to make herself smaller to avoid conflict. Now, she did the opposite without raising her voice or lifting her chin too high. She simply stayed. The crowd responded instinctively. Some neighbors who had avoided the situation earlier edged closer, drawn by a sense of moral gravity they could no longer ignore. Others whispered apologies not yet spoken aloud. A few nodded subtly, as if acknowledging truths they had witnessed many times before but rarely challenged. Walter's gaze remained forward, his expression calm but resolute. Inside, memories surged, of moments when fairness had been promised and quietly withheld, of systems that demanded proof beyond reason. He felt the familiar weight of age and race pressing against him, but now it met resistance. Not from anger, but from presence, from being undeniable. Victor's composure fractured further. He wiped his brow, adjusted his stance, glanced toward the street as if searching for an exit that had not existed moments earlier. His power had relied on isolation, on the assumption that no one would intervene, no one would question, no one would look too closely. That assumption had evaporated. The rain eased into a mist, softening the streetlights and blurring the edges of the crowd, but the focus remained sharp. Every phone stayed raised. Every breath felt suspended. The tension did not dissipate, it concentrated, pulling everyone toward a single point of consequence. Alina finally opened her hand just slightly, revealing the brass key resting against her palm. She did not raise it. She did not speak. The gesture was small, almost private, yet it carried weight. It was a reminder of ownership, of continuity, of a life that had been built rather than taken. The rising action reached its peak not with confrontation, but with clarity. The injustice could no longer hide behind process or pretense. It stood exposed in full view, stripped of its quiet efficiency. And as the moment stretched toward its breaking point, one truth settled across the block with unmistakable force. Whatever happened next would redefine everything that had led to this porch, this house, this day. The story was no longer about removal. It was about accountability. The street no longer felt like a neighborhood. It felt like a courtroom without walls. Rain clung to the air, thin and cold, misting faces and darkening fabric, but no one moved away. The crowd had grown too large, too invested. Phones hovered at eye level, steady now. no longer curious but intent. Every breath, every shift of weight, every tightening jaw was being recorded. What had started as an eviction had hardened into something far more dangerous for those who believed power worked best in silence. Victor stood at the center of it, folder clenched too tightly in his hand, the edges bent. The confidence that had carried him up the porch steps earlier was gone, replaced by something brittle and reactive. He spoke again, louder than necessary, insisting on deadlines, insisting on authority, insisting that this moment would bend if he pushed hard enough. But his words no longer landed cleanly. They scattered, colliding with murmurs, with raised eyebrows, with the unmistakable shift of belief happening in real time. Alina felt the worst of it then, not fear, not grief, but exposure. Decades of being careful, of surviving by staying composed, by never appearing threatening or defiant, suddenly pressed against her chest. She stood there knowing that any movement, any crack in her posture could be misread. The injustice was no longer abstract. It was immediate. It was embodied in the way Victor spoke around her, in the way authority hovered without fully protecting her, in the way history whispered that moments like this did not always end safely. Walter sensed it too. His pulse thudded in his ears, louder than the rain. He tightened his grip on his cane, grounding himself against the porch boards. He had lived long enough to recognize the edge of danger, the moment when rules could be twisted, when procedure could be weaponized, when being right did not guarantee being safe. He had seen it happen to others. He had survived it himself. And now, standing beside Alina, he felt that familiar tightening in his chest that came when dignity was tested in public. The sheriff hesitated again, longer this time. His eyes moved between faces, between documents, between the growing crowd. The posture of certainty he had arrived with was gone. What remained was calculation, awareness, the understanding that this situation was no longer contained, no longer procedural. Whatever decision he made would echo beyond this block. Victor sensed the shift and reacted poorly. He stepped forward, voice rising, invading space, pressing urgency where caution should have lived. His frustration sharpened his words, stripping them of polish. Accusations slipped out, about delays, about resistance, about entitlement. Each word revealed more than he intended. Each sentence pulled the mask lower. The crowd reacted audibly now, a sharp intake of breath, a murmur of disbelief. Someone whispered a single word that cut through the rain: "This is wrong." Alina's breath caught, not because of the words themselves, but because of what they represented. This was the moment she had spent a lifetime preparing for without ever wanting to face. The moment when survival required stillness, when dignity demanded restraint, when the cost of being misunderstood felt unbearably high. She thought of the house behind her, of the years compressed into its walls, of the nights spent worrying whether safety would last, of the children who had once slept under that roof, who had grown up learning what it meant to be watched, to be doubted, to be underestimated. She felt the brass key against her palm and understood with sudden clarity that this moment was not just about staying. It was about being seen fully, without shrinking. Walter shifted slightly, placing himself just enough in front of Alina to matter. The movement was subtle, instinctive, protective. Cameras caught it. So did the crowd. The image was unmistakable, an elderly man bracing himself not against weakness but against erasure. Victor's voice faltered mid-sentence. For the first time he looked uncertain, not just frustrated but unsettled. The crowd was no longer passive. Authority was no longer aligned. The narrative he had relied on was collapsing faster than he could rewrite it. He glanced toward the sheriff again, searching for reinforcement that did not come. Silence spread, heavy and electric. The rain stopped completely. In that stillness, the street seemed to hold its breath. Every phone remained lifted, every eye fixed forward. The next decision, one word, one motion, would determine whether this moment ended as another quiet injustice or something far more explosive. Alina lifted her head. Not high, not defiant. Just enough. And in that single movement the balance shifted. The moment Alina lifted her head, the street responded. It wasn't dramatic. There was no shout, no sudden movement. Yet something invisible shifted, like pressure changing before a storm breaks. The crowd leaned in without realizing it. Phones steadied. Even Victor stopped talking, his last word hanging unfinished in the air, stripped of authority the instant it left his mouth. Alina's face held years of discipline, years of learning how to exist safely inside spaces that never fully welcomed her. She did not glare. She did not plead. She simply met the moment exactly as it was, refusing to collapse under it. Walter felt the weight of that choice. He could sense how fragile the balance was now. One wrong move from anyone and the situation could spiral. He remembered stories passed quietly through generations, warnings wrapped in advice. Stay calm, don't escalate. Let them think they're in control. But standing there with the house behind him and the crowd before him, he also knew another truth. Silence had already been mistaken for surrender. Victor tried to reclaim the moment. He cleared his throat sharply, stepped back half a pace, then forward again, recalibrating. His voice returned, louder, clipped, sharpened by impatience. He spoke of authority again, of ownership, of consequences. He gestured toward the movers, toward the sheriff, toward the door of the house as if proximity alone could force reality to comply. But something was different now. His words landed and stayed there, unsupported. The sheriff did not move. The movers remained still. The crowd did not thin. No one rushed to restore Victor's sense of control. The power he had relied on, procedural momentum, had stalled completely. And that frightened him. Fear does not always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like insistence, like doubling down, like raising your voice because you no longer trust it to carry on its own. Victor spoke again, faster this time, listing dates, numbers, alleged violations. But his delivery cracked under scrutiny. He contradicted himself without realizing it. He referenced documents no one else had seen. Each sentence introduced a new inconsistency, and the people listening felt it, even if they couldn't yet name it. The crowd murmured again, louder now, not gossip, judgment. Walter watched faces change. He saw neighbors who had once looked away now staring openly. He saw disbelief turn to recognition. Recognition turned to anger. Anger turned to resolve. This was no longer entertainment. This was exposure. Alina's hand trembled once, just once, before steadying. She felt the familiar burn behind her eyes but refused to let it surface. She had cried enough in private. This moment demanded something else. The sheriff finally spoke. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it carried weight because it cut through everything else. A simple request, clarification, verification. He asked Victor to pause. He asked for documentation to be reviewed again, properly, on record. Victor stiffened. That single word, pause, hit harder than any accusation. His entire approach had depended on forward motion, on overwhelming resistance before it could gather strength. A pause meant scrutiny. A pause meant time. A pause meant risk. He objected immediately, frustration bleeding into his tone. He argued that delays were unnecessary, that everything had already been reviewed, that the matter was settled. The sheriff did not respond right away. Instead, he looked out at the crowd, at the phones, at the witnesses, at the elderly couple standing their ground without raising their voices. Then he looked back at Victor. And waited. The silence that followed was devastating. Victor spoke again, but this time his voice lacked conviction. The crowd sensed it. The phones captured it. The balance tipped further inch by inch. Alina felt her chest tighten as memories flooded in, moments when fairness had been promised but quietly withheld, when compliance had been demanded without protection. She thought of every time she had been told to be patient, to trust the process, to wait her turn. This was the process, and it was finally being forced to slow down. Walter shifted again, pain flaring briefly in his leg, but he ignored it. He focused instead on staying upright, visible, unyielding. He realized something then, something that made his jaw tighten with both pride and grief. They had never been expected to fight. They had been expected to fold. Victor sensed the crowd turning fully against him now. He tried one last tactic, casting doubt. He suggested confusion, misunderstanding. He implied that the Brooks were mistaken, overwhelmed, incapable of fully grasping the situation. The implication landed like an insult, wrapped in concern. The reaction was immediate. A sharp sound cut through the murmurs, someone scoffing openly. Another voice rose, louder than intended. The crowd shifted, bodies pressing closer, not in aggression but in solidarity. The line between observer and participant blurred. Alina felt it then, something she had not allowed herself to feel in years. Validation. Not sympathy, not pity. Recognition. She did not smile, but her shoulders squared in a way they hadn't before. She stood taller, not because she was winning, but because she was no longer invisible. The sheriff's posture changed again, this time unmistakably. He closed his folder halfway, not fully, but enough to signal restraint. He addressed Victor directly, his tone firmer now, less accommodating. He referenced discrepancies, requested additional review, mentioned protocol that had not been followed. Each word landed like a measured blow. Victor's face flushed. He opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. His eyes darted again, this time toward the crowd, toward the cameras, toward the reality that this moment was already escaping him. The rain began again lightly, as if on cue. Alina felt a strange calm settle over her. Not peace, something steadier. Resolve without desperation. Whatever happened next, she knew this. The injustice had failed to stay hidden. The house behind her stood quiet, waiting. Victor took one final step forward, his voice tight, controlled with visible effort. He attempted to reassert himself, to draw a line, to force a conclusion. But before the words could fully leave his mouth, another sound entered the street. A low engine. Approaching. Deliberate. The crowd turned as one. Alina's breath caught. Walter's grip tightened. Victor froze. Whatever was arriving now was not part of his plan. And the moment he realized that, everything changed. The engine sound rolled down the block with intent, slow and unmistakable. It wasn't rushing. It didn't need to. Its presence alone commanded attention. The crowd parted instinctively as the vehicle came into view, its tires cutting clean lines through the wet street. Headlights washed over faces already tense, already braced for impact. Victor turned fully now, his confidence draining in real time. This was not part of his calculation. Whatever advantage he thought he still held evaporated with each passing second the vehicle remained in sight. The car stopped. For a moment, no one moved. Then the door opened. The figure who stepped out carried no urgency, no hesitation. Every movement was controlled, deliberate, as if the outcome had already been decided long before this moment. The crowd leaned forward, phones adjusting automatically. Whispers surged, trying to name what they were witnessing before understanding it. Alina felt her heart pound so loudly she was sure others could hear it. The sound of the rain faded into the background. Her focus narrowed to the space between the curb and the porch, to the unfolding reality she had not dared to imagine. Walter inhaled slowly, grounding himself. He had lived long enough to know that turning points rarely announced themselves. They arrived quietly, disguised as interruption. The newcomer crossed the street without acknowledging the crowd. Their attention went straight to the porch, straight to Alina and Walter. The look exchanged in that instant carried decades: recognition, protection, resolve. It was not dramatic. It was undeniable. Victor spoke, quickly, nervously, trying to reassert relevance. He demanded identification, authority, explanation. His words tumbled over one another, stripped of polish, revealing urgency where there should have been certainty. He was answered, not with argument but with fact. Documents were produced, clean, organized, undeniable. They changed hands with calm precision. The sheriff accepted them, his expression tightening as he read. He read again, then again more slowly. The crowd went silent. What had been whispered speculation hardened into comprehension. Whatever Victor had built his case on was collapsing under scrutiny it could not survive. Alina felt a sharp sting behind her eyes, but she did not look away. She watched as the power dynamic she had feared all her life reversed itself in plain view. The injustice that had relied on assumption and pressure now faced exposure, stripped bare by evidence and witness. Walter exhaled, a sound he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His shoulders lowered slightly, not in relief, but in release. The weight of being doubted, of being treated as disposable, loosened its grip for the first time in weeks. The sheriff straightened. His voice, when it came, carried authority without hostility. He spoke clearly, deliberately, each word landing with finality. The action being taken was paused, then stopped, then invalidated. Procedures had not been followed. Claims did not hold. The eviction could not proceed. The words echoed. Victor reacted as if struck. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. He tried to speak, to protest, to reclaim ground. But no one moved to support him. Not the movers, not the sheriff, not the crowd. Phones captured everything. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. Alina felt her knees threaten to give, not from weakness, but from the sudden absence of fear she had been carrying for so long. She pressed the brass key into her palm, grounding herself in the present. The house behind her stood unchanged, solid, unyielding. Walter reached for her hand, steadying both of them. He did not speak. He didn't need to. Victor stepped back, his folder slipping from his grip. Papers scattered across the wet pavement, ink bleeding into rainwater. He bent to retrieve them, hands shaking, movements clumsy and exposed. The image burned itself into the moment, control lost, power undone. The crowd reacted then, not with chaos but with release. A collective breath, a murmur that grew into something warmer, something human. Recognition rippled through the block. This was not how the story had been expected to end. Alina took one step forward. Just one. She lifted the brass key, not as a weapon, not as a threat, but as a symbol. 40 years of life, memory, and endurance rested in that small, shining object. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, but it carried. This home had not been taken. It had been defended. Victor turned away, retreating through the parting crowd, smaller with every step. The cameras followed him, documenting not triumph but consequence. As his figure disappeared down the street, the rain softened again, misting the air, blurring edges. The porch light flickered once, then steadied. Alina and Walter stood together, surrounded by witnesses, no longer isolated, no longer unseen. The worst moment had passed. The injustice had been confronted. The truth had landed where it could no longer be ignored. The street would remember this. So would everyone watching. And what came next would not be about survival. It would be about impact. When the street finally began to empty, it did so slowly, as if no one quite knew how to leave a moment like this behind. The rain thinned to a whisper, and the last few phones lowered, though some remained pointed toward the porch, unwilling to let go of proof that something rare had just occurred. The house stood unchanged, brick and wood holding steady against the gray sky, but everything around it felt altered. Alina noticed the quiet first. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of threat. The tightness that had lived in her chest for weeks, months, perhaps longer, began to loosen in small, unfamiliar increments. Her breathing slowed. Her shoulders dropped. She realized how much of herself she had been holding rigid, braced for impact that never came. Walter guided her gently toward the porch swing, the same one that had carried laughter years earlier. The wood creaked under their weight, a sound so ordinary it nearly undid her. Ordinary sounds had felt dangerous for a while, as if peace itself could be taken away without warning. Now, the creak felt like reassurance, like continuity. They sat together without speaking. Words had done enough damage for one day. Around them, neighbors lingered at the edges of their property, uncertain how to approach now that the spectacle had passed. Some nodded respectfully. Others murmured quiet apologies meant as much for themselves as for Eleanor and Walter. A few looked ashamed. A few looked relieved. All of them looked changed. Inside the house, the air felt different, not lighter, deeper, as though the walls had absorbed what happened and were now releasing it slowly, carefully. Eleanor stepped inside first, touching the doorframe as she crossed the threshold, grounding herself in the familiar texture. The smell of lemon oil and old paper greeted her, unchanged. It made her eyes sting. Walter followed, closing the door behind them with deliberate care. For a long moment, they simply stood there. Then Eleanor laughed, softly, briefly, surprised by the sound of it. It carried no humor, only release. Walter smiled in response, the kind of smile that doesn't show teeth but holds history. He reached into his pocket and placed the brass key on the small table by the door, setting it down with reverence. For the first time in weeks, the key rested instead of being clutched. Outside, the story continued to move. Footage traveled faster than truth usually does. Clips were shared, replayed, dissected. Viewers saw what paperwork alone could never show: the posture, the tone, the imbalance, the moment when power assumed silence and found resistance instead. People recognized the pattern immediately, even if they had never experienced it firsthand. Especially then. Messages began arriving that evening. Some were supportive, some angry, some heartbreakingly familiar in their repetition of similar experiences. Families pushed out quietly. Elders pressured until exhaustion did the work that legality could not. Homes lost not because rules were broken but because power was uneven. Eleanor read only a few before setting the phone down. She did not need to absorb the world's pain all at once. What mattered most was that the truth had traveled beyond the block, that the injustice had failed to stay contained. Walter noticed how tired she looked, not weakened but spent. He brewed tea, the same way he always had, measuring carefully. His hands steadier now than they had been all day. The ritual grounded them both. It reminded them that survival was often built on small, repeated acts of care. That night sleep came unevenly but honestly. Eleanor dreamed of doors opening and closing, of rooms filling with light. Walter dreamed of footsteps that stopped following him. Neither dream was perfect. Healing rarely is, but both woke without the weight of dread pressing down on their chests. In the days that followed, the impact of what happened became clearer. Officials called, paperwork was corrected, language softened where it had once been sharp, processes slowed, eyes watched more carefully. The system did not transform overnight, but it adjusted just enough to acknowledge it had been challenged. And the neighborhood changed too. People spoke more openly, checked in more often. Some admitted they had assumed the worst. Others admitted they had stayed silent out of fear or convenience. Eleanor listened without judgment. She knew silence intimately. She also knew how difficult it was to break. What stayed with her most was not the confrontation itself, but the moment it ended, the instant when fear loosened its grip and was replaced by something sturdier. Not victory, not pride. Belonging. The house remained what it had always been, but now it carried an additional weight, proof that resistance did not always have to be loud to be effective, and that dignity, when witnessed, could interrupt even the most well-practiced injustice. Yet Eleanor understood something deeply as she sat by the window one evening, watching the street settle back into routine. This was not an ending. It was a pause. A rare one. And pauses, she knew, were only meaningful if people used them to look more closely at what came before and what might come next. The days that followed did not bring a return to normal. They brought awareness. Alina noticed it first in the way people spoke to her now. Not with pity, and not with the thin politeness reserved for elders people planned to ignore, but with recognition. Strangers who passed the house slowed their steps. Some waved. Some paused just long enough to say they were glad she and Walter were still there. A few admitted, quietly, that they had once assumed the couple would eventually be forced out like so many others. The honesty stung, but it also clarified something Alina had long suspected. Injustice survives best when it is expected. Walter felt the shift differently. He noticed it in institutions, in the tone of follow-up calls, in the sudden thoroughness of reviews that once felt dismissive. Systems that had previously moved with blunt certainty now moved carefully, aware they were being watched. It was not reform, it was caution. But even caution, Walter knew, could save lives when wielded in the right moment. The footage continued to circulate. People replayed it not just for drama, but for meaning. They paused on moments others might have missed. The way Victor spoke without looking at Alina directly. The way authority hesitated until witnesses appeared. The way an elderly couple had been expected to quietly comply. Viewers saw patterns mirrored in their own lives. Comment sections filled with stories that sounded too familiar to dismiss as coincidence. Evictions that followed the law but crushed families. Complaints ignored until cameras appeared. Elders pressured because it was assumed they lacked the energy to fight back. What happened on that porch became a reference point. Not a miracle, but a mirror. Alina read some of the messages late at night when the house was quiet and her thoughts wandered. She read about people who had lost homes because they were isolated, about neighbors who regretted not stepping in, about families who wished they had documented sooner, spoken louder, stayed longer. Each message carried grief, but also resolve. People were asking questions they hadn't asked before. Who benefits when silence is treated as consent? Who pays when procedure is allowed to replace humanity? Walter spent more time on the porch those days, not out of vigilance but visibility. He waved to passers-by, spoke with neighbors he had barely known before. He did not lecture. He did not recount the story unless asked. His presence alone seemed to anchor something on the block, a reminder that stability could exist without surrender. The house, once viewed as a target, became a landmark. Alina realized the irony of it one afternoon as she watched children ride bikes past the fence. For years, the house had been invisible to anyone who did not need it gone. Now it was seen not for its market value, but for its meaning. It stood as evidence that resistance did not always look like protest. Sometimes it looked like refusing to leave. Still, Alina did not romanticize what happened. She knew how close they had come to losing everything, how easily the outcome could have shifted if timing had been different, if witnesses had not stayed, if fear had won. The thought unsettled her. It reminded her that justice as it existed was fragile, often conditional. That was the part that stayed with her the most. The victory was real, but so was the vulnerability that preceded it. Walter understood this too. He spoke about it one evening quietly without bitterness. He said that what saved them was not goodness alone but interruption. Someone noticed. Someone questioned. Someone slowed the process down. Without that interruption, the system would have done exactly what it was designed to do, move forward without regard for consequence. The story began to travel beyond the neighborhood, beyond the city. Advocacy groups referenced it. Community meetings discussed it. Not as entertainment, but as example, as warning, as proof that patterns repeat until they are confronted. Alina found herself invited into conversations she had never been part of before, panels, local discussions, not as a symbol but as a witness. She spoke carefully, choosing honesty over performance. She said what it felt like to be pressured politely, what it meant to age inside a system that assumed your silence was agreement, what it took to keep standing when you were expected to shrink. She did not speak of heroes. She spoke of cost. The cost of vigilance. The cost of exhaustion. The cost of being targeted simply because someone believed you would not fight back. And people listened. Not all of them, but enough. The impact of what happened was not that injustice disappeared. It was that fewer people could claim ignorance. The pattern had been named, the mechanism exposed, and once exposed, it could no longer operate with the same ease. One evening, Alina stood at the window again, watching dusk settle over the street. The porch light came on automatically, bathing the steps in soft gold. The same light that had flickered during the confrontation now held steady. She thought about how many stories like theirs ended differently, how many elders were never seen, how many homes were lost quietly, efficiently, without witnesses. And she understood something with painful clarity. Their story mattered not because it was rare, but because it was common. What made it different was that this time, the ending changed. The weeks turned into months and the house remained. Not because the world suddenly became fair, but because, for once, fairness had been forced into the open. Alina noticed how that distinction mattered. Justice had not arrived gently. It had arrived because people stayed, because eyes watched, because silence was broken before it could finish the job. Life resumed, but it did not reset. Walter returned to his routines, though he carried them differently now. He still swept the porch, still fixed what loosened, still kept his records neat and exact. But there was a new awareness in him, one shaped not by fear, but by clarity. He understood now how close they had come to vanishing from a system that would have recorded their removal as ordinary, lawful, unremarkable. Alina felt changed in quieter ways. She slept more deeply. She laughed more easily. But she also noticed how often her thoughts returned to others, people who never got a pause, never got witnesses, never got a second look. She thought of elders pressured behind closed doors, families forced out without cameras, voices dismissed because they were tired, poor, or alone. Their home became a place people pointed to when talking about what almost happened. And that almost carried weight. Neighbors spoke more freely now. When unfamiliar faces lingered too long on the sidewalk, questions were asked instead of swallowed. When paperwork arrived that didn't feel right, it was examined instead of accepted. The block learned something together, something fragile but powerful, that injustice depends on isolation. And isolation only works when everyone agrees to look away. Alina did not call what happened a victory. She called it survival with witnesses. She knew the system had not changed its nature. It had only been interrupted. An interruption, she understood, was something ordinary people could create, not through force, but through attention, presence, and refusal to disappear quietly. The story eventually faded from feeds and headlines. Another outrage replaced it. Another crisis demanded attention. That was how the world moved. But the impact remained in subtler places, in how people noticed patterns sooner, in how questions were asked more sharply, in how silence became harder to justify. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the porch light clicked on, Alina placed the brass key back on its ribbon and hung it by the door. Not because she needed to clutch it anymore, but because it belonged there, visible, resting, unafraid. Walter joined her on the porch swing, the same one that had held their children, their worries, their waiting. The street was quiet, ordinary, and that ordinariness felt earned. They sat together as the night settled, not talking about what they had endured, but about what they hoped others might learn. That injustice doesn't always announce itself loudly. That racism often hides behind paperwork, patience, and pressure. That the most dangerous assumption is believing something won't happen to you, because it hasn't yet. Their story ended not with celebration, but with resolve. Because the truth is this: for every story that ends with a pause, there are countless others that end with loss. Homes taken, dignity stripped, lives displaced without record or witness. The question is not whether racism still operates this way. It does. The real question is whether we will recognize it sooner next time. Whether we will stay when it's uncomfortable. Whether we will speak before silence finishes the job. Because justice doesn't begin in courtrooms or headlines. It begins the moment someone decides not to look away. And when that moment comes, will you be watching? Or will you be standing there too?